My name is Claire, and I live in Ireland. My sister Sonia has always been my best friend. 3 years ago, Sonia came over to my place excitedly telling me about a date she had with a new guy at work named Eric. I was happy for her, as she had broken up with her abusive ex-boyfriend a few months earlier and was finally starting to enjoy life, as well as being an amazing mother to her little boy. As the next few weeks passed, Sonia and Eric had gone on a few dates, but it was nothing serious at all. All seemed to be going smoothly, until one night I got a call from Sonia. When I answered the phone, she was upset. She told me that she had been out with Eric and that she had went out to have a cigarette. A few moments later, he came out shouting at her, telling her she was taking too long and she must have been flirting with other guys. Then he called her a slut. I was shocked, and understandably so was Sonia. She said he just changed into a different person for no reason. She told me she was finished with him because she had already had an abusive relationship and she wouldn't go down that road again. I agreed that that was the right thing to do. The following day, Sonia was bombarded with text from Eric, begging for forgiveness and another chance. She told him no way and to leave her alone because she wouldn't accept being spoken to that way. But he wouldn't stop texting her. This went on for days, and Sonia repeatedly told him to leave her alone. One day, while Sonia and Eric were at work, Eric walked off the job. A while later, he texted Sonia saying he was in a hotel with a rope and he was going to hang himself. My sister was a very kind person, so this upset her, and she texted him back not to do it and to get help, and that he also shouldn't put his family through that pain of losing him. A few hours later, he texted back saying he couldn't do it, and he just needed to see her. She told him that she didn't want to meet up, but that he should get help. A few days later, Eric came back to work. Sonia told me that he kept staring at her, and it was freaking her out. When she got home from work, Eric texted her that there was a rumor going around work that he was stalking her. She replied that she hadn't heard about that rumor, but told him that he was freaking her out with the way he was always staring at her. Sonia told me she was going to ask to change shifts because he made her feel so uncomfortable. Over the next few days, Eric's texts became non-stop, telling Sonia that he needed to be with her and that she was cold-hearted for not being with him. She told him to just leave her alone and to move on, and that it wasn't normal to be acting this way after only a few dates. She then blocked him from Facebook and from her phone. We thought that would be the end of that, but we were so wrong. During the next 2 weeks, a guy named Shane added Sonia to Facebook. Their conversation started off friendly, but soon became flirty. She seemed to like Shane, so she arranged to meet him in a hotel for a bit of fun. Please don't judge my sister. She was a good person and all adults do stuff at this point. I know meeting at a hotel is a bad decision for her to make, but nothing can ever change that now. On the 15th of February 2004, it was Sonia's son's 3rd birthday. We were all going to the play center to have a little party for him, and Sonia was going to meet Shane later that night while her son was at a sleepover at our mother's house. The day went great, and we all had fun. That night at around 9 p.m., Sonia checked into the hotel room where she was meeting Shane. He said he would be arriving a little later, as he had a few things to do, so Sonia just chilled in the hotel texting me. The last text I received from her was at 11:40 p.m. The next morning at 11, my mother called me asking if I'd heard from Sonia. She was supposed to collect her son, but my mother couldn't get a reply when she had called or texted. I tried to call her, but there was no answer. Hours passed and I thought she was just hung over in bed or something. Nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. My mother and I were sitting drinking tea together at around 4 p.m. when there was a knock at the door. "That must be Sonia," I said. We answered the door and were greeted by 2 policemen. Immediately, my stomach sank. They asked if they could come in, and of course we let them in. They told us that Sonia's body had been found dead on the hotel room floor and that she had been strangled to death. My mother and I sobbed uncontrollably. We just couldn't believe what we were hearing. My beautiful sister couldn't be dead. No way. We went to the hospital with the police, and to our absolute horror, it was true. Sonia was dead. The next few hours were just a blur. Later that night, a man handed himself into the police and admitted that he killed Sonia. It was fucking Eric. There never was a Shane. It was Eric the whole time. He had set up a fake Facebook page so he could lure Sonia to the hotel and murder her. He gave my gorgeous sister a horrifically brutal death, and we soon found out that he raped her too. Eric raped Sonia, and then he beat her up. She tried to fight back, so he strangled her. First, he tried to do it with her phone charger, but when that wasn't working, he used his hands to strangle her. He also shoved her top inside her mouth with such force that it broke her teeth and dislodged her retainer. This was to silence her, according to him. It took 3 years for the trial to begin. It was over within the last few weeks, actually. The sick bastard pleaded not guilty and claimed that he suffered from a mental illness. This makes me sick. He premeditated her murder. There is no question about that. For 2 weeks, my family and I had to sit in a court listening to the details of the horrific death Sonia suffered. But thank God he was found guilty of her murder. I'm writing this on the day of his sentencing, Friday the 26th of May, 2017. Eric was sentenced to life in prison for murdering my sister. I am glad he was convicted for making my amazing sister suffer and for leaving her son without a mother. I am now raising Sonia's son with my own children. He's 6 now, and I always tell him about his mother and how much she loved him. I would just like to warn everyone about the dangers of social media. Please be careful and don't meet anyone in hotels. If you're going to meet someone from social media, at least do it in a public place. This error in judgment cost Sonia her life. This is a photo of Sonia, taken the day she was murdered. I just want everyone to see the beautiful woman that scumbag stole from mine and my family's lives. I blocked out her son's face, for obvious reasons. The grief I feel from losing my sister is so overwhelming, even 3 years later. I'm just hoping one day it gets easier to cope with the pain. This memory of mine begins about 3 years ago, when I graduated high school. I had grown up with my grandparents, but decided to move to a different, and much larger, city to live with my dad for the first time in 12 years. I somewhat knew the city already, because I spent my summers with him, but this would be my first time I would have the freedom of an adult, to come and go as I pleased, drive my car anywhere, smoke cigarettes, whatever I wanted. I was excited, though sad to leave all of my friends. As soon as I settled in, my dad and stepmom sat down to discuss the new rules and what I needed to know about the complex. Basic things like, go wherever you want, but let us know when you leave and when you're coming back, even if it's 2 a.m. And you'll have to park on the street. And also, one more thing, there's the neighborhood creep. This guy, George, was well known by all the women in the complex, as well as the police that patrolled the area. He was tall and fairly big, and very intimidating looking. My parents were pretty certain that he would leave me alone for one reason: my dad. Though George had a habit of stalking other women in the complex, he would stop and find a new target if they had a man make a show of being in their place. A brother, a lover, or a father. It didn't matter what he was to the woman, or what he looked like. George would back off immediately. Since I lived with my dad, who was also quite tall, and rather intimidating, I felt very confident that I would be alright. And I was. For a time. It started about 6 months after I moved in. My stepmom and dad were fighting a lot more, until she got up and left him. One night, I was sitting on my porch having a cigarette, and browsing Facebook or whatever. I wish I could say that I had a feeling like I was being watched, but I probably just looked up because I felt a bug or something. George was standing about 15 feet away, a little bit behind a tree, staring intently at me. I nearly dropped my cigarette. Shakily, I stubbed it out and went inside. I was home alone, so I made sure to lock all my doors and then played a video game in my room. I told myself that I was probably just paranoid. The next morning I got up for my cigarette and coffee. Lo and behold, minutes after I got on the porch, George came ambling out of his apartment to look my way. I sucked down my cigarette and went back inside. This pattern continued for a couple of weeks. It was like George stood at his sliding glass door peeking out, waiting to see when I would pop out. I told my dad about it, and he tried to sit with me whenever I went to smoke. If he came with me, George wouldn't even peep a head out the door. Of course, the other women in the complex had already tried to call the police about George, but he lives in the complex, and staring isn't a crime, so there wasn't much they could do. I didn't know how far George had taken it with the other women before. With that info in mind, I knew calling wouldn't be much use. Things slowly escalated. Once my stepmom left, I had access to her parking spot. So, I had 3 ways to get from my car to my apartment, depending on how I parked. One of the ways went just past George's apartment, about 5 feet from his door. Since I got off work late most nights, I avoided that route as much as possible. Slowly but surely, like he memorized my schedule, he would be on one of the paths when I was coming home. Not directly on the concrete, but a few feet away on the grass, behind a tree. It was like he thought I couldn't see him. Picture a child hiding very terribly behind a tree. You can see 90% of their body and you know that they're there. That's how he would do it. I would rush past him, avoiding eye contact, but prepared to scream if I ever heard him come after me. I started carrying my keys between my fingertips. I bought a pocket knife and I would walk from my car with it halfway open already, even though I've never been in any kind of fight in my life. Around this time, I believe my mom was trying to find me some free self-defense classes, since I couldn't afford anything on my tight budget. My dad was steadily getting more and more pissed off as George edged closer and closer to escalating as the days went by. It went from November to May. If my dad wasn't home, I would lock my bedroom door and keep my knife under my pillow. I would Skype all night with my boyfriend, just so someone could call 911 if need be. I put a bunch of flower pots in front of my bedroom window so no one could get in silently. I started sitting on the floor of my porch below the wall out of sight to smoke, but angled so I could see him if he walked up to it. Nightmares of being kidnapped, raped, or murdered started to invade my sleep every night. Then one day my neighbor Shell was gossiping to me. "Did you hear about George?" "No." "He got arrested last night." In the complex parking lot, there's a big sort of electrical power box. It stands about waist high and is perhaps 2 or 3 feet wide. About 10 minutes before I was supposed to come home and park right in front of it, some lady with her kid walked by and saw George sitting on the box masturbating. Was he waiting there for me? Jerking off at the thought of me seeing him? The thought makes me want to puke and scares me all at the same time. I was relieved for a few days of my stress, but it was only a few days that he was gone. Then he was back, and he went right back to the same old routine. One night he got far braver. It was maybe 7 p.m. and I went out for a cigarette with my dad. A neighbor walked up to chat with my dad, and George came outside and stood out in the open, staring me down. "Dude's asking to get his fucking ass kicked," my dad said under his breath. Then he chatted to the neighbor some more. I rolled my eyes, went inside and played more video games. I was healing in a World of Warcraft dungeon when I heard Shell shouting, "Where the hell are you?" But I was healing, a pretty important job, and I figured she was talking to someone else, until she burst into my room in a panic, her eyes huge. She hopped from foot to foot frantically like she was doing the potty dance. "He's bleeding!" "Who?" I asked in bewilderment. "Your dad! Come quick!" I made some teenager's huffing sound and left my computer, certainly pissing off the rest of the group. I grabbed our little first aid kit filled with band-aids. I thought in my mind that my dad was doing something stupid, like tossing up his pocket knife and trying to catch it. But when I stepped outside, I found myself face to face with a real horror. About 6 people surrounded my dad, including Shell, and my neighbor Caleb held a shirt to my dad's side. He was facing away from me, and his entire back was covered in blood. It looked like he had been mauled by a bear. Seriously, my first thought was, I didn't know we had bears in this city. Caleb's hold on the shirt slipped, and blood sprayed. I feel queasy writing this down. I have never in my life been the person to turn to in an emergency. Blood makes me lightheaded, and I have anxiety attacks over not being able to find a specific bookmark. But all of the adults, people around 30 through 40, while I was just 18, around me were looking panicked aside from Caleb. I needed to be that person that people turned to. I threw the first aid kit on the porch and told Shell where we keep our towels. She rushed to grab one. "Has anyone called 911? I shouted. 5 pairs of eyes looked at me like they'd never heard of 911 before. "No," my dad said. "I can't afford an ambulance." "Shut up," I said. "What happened?" "That fucker stabbed me." So I dialed 911 and relayed our address and the reason for emergency. The operator told us to keep applying pressure to the wound on my father's lower back. My dad is a true champ. Even though the sidewalk was one big puddle of blood, he stayed on his feet until someone thought to go and grab a chair for him. I ran back and forth along the walkways to get the police and show them the house that George lived in, and then I ran back and forth to get the paramedics. They were so cold and so agonizingly slow. They walked calmly, and I wanted to scream at them to run. My dad could be bleeding out. Don't you care? I learned later that they don't run because if they let adrenaline in, mistakes can happen. They shoved Caleb out of the way because he refused to let go of my dad's wound and got him packed up in the ambulance. I was about to jump on when the police stopped me and told me that I had to stay so I could give a statement. My dad shouted at me to call his boss, and I remembered all his allergies and whatnot for the paramedics. God, 2 years later and all these details have burned into my mind. I gave my statement to the police. Then they made me sit outside the complex on the sidewalk for 2 to 3 hours. They kept me updated on my dad. Once I had called his boss, my boss, and answered my stepmom's message, that's when I allowed myself to break down. It felt like I cried forever. One of the cops was nice enough to go into my house and grab my cigarettes and a bottle of water for me. He stayed with me the entire time to make sure I didn't run off or something, but he was very nice. He offered to let me sit in his cruiser a few times to get away from the cold. George was waiting in his apartment when they came. When they took him out to where I was, and there were 14 cop cars. 14! He still kept trying to stare at me. I stared right back and felt such hatred that I have never in my life felt. I wanted to go over there and murder him. My babysitting cop looked over and saw that George was staring, so he used his flashlight to keep George from being able to look at me. Once it was all over, I was allowed to go back into my house, where I waited for information about my dad. I gathered the story from my neighbors while he was in the hospital for 9 days. He had shouted at George to leave his daughter alone, and George had shouted back at him while I was in the house, totally unaware. George said something along the lines of, "Come and tell me that to my face like a man." So my dad hopped over the porch and waltzed up to him. The creep had been waiting with a 12-inch blade held to the side of his leg. He struck out with his empty hand, then got my dad in the back with the knife. It missed his kidney very, very narrowly, traveled up and punctured his lung and damaged his diaphragm. My dad didn't realize he had been stabbed at first. He got George into a headlock and pummeled the shit out of him, thinking the dude had just punched him in the kidney. George dropped the knife, rolled in the grass, and picked up another knife he had been hiding and stabbed my dad again, this time in the upper back. This wound was much more shallow, but still required stitches later. At this point, Shell came outside and screamed to my dad that he was bleeding. He took off his shirt, got pissed, and threw it at George. At that point, the neighborhood stalker put his hands up and went into his apartment. The blood stayed on the pavement until about noon the next day, when my neighbors kindly washed it off for me. My dad spent more time in the hospital in critical condition than George spent being in jail. I feel like it was my fault. I've been addressing that in therapy, but I still feel awful about it, like my dad had to fight my battle for me. Throughout the week while I was on my porch, or just outside, I had so many women come up to me. They all told me to thank my dad for them. They had all been terrorized by George at some point, and now they were certain he would be away for good. Several poor women have had George stalk them to their apartment door and pull down his pants, demanding sex. I can't believe the cops couldn't do anything. One of those days, one of my neighbors came up to tell me that the police and neighbors had searched the complex and found that George had stashed many knives all over the place, buried in the garden, stuck behind trees, under his doormat. I shudder to think that he might have planned to one day grab one of his targets and do something far more sinister than stare. George was declared guilty for battery with a deadly weapon, but the attempted murder charge was dropped. He was out of prison by Christmas on good behavior or whatever, but my dad and I still have a lifelong restraining order against him. He has never tried to come after me, so I can only hope that he's terrified of my dad. I wish I could tell you guys that I took self-defense classes and learned to fight the way my dad can, but I'm still a pussy who can't even slap a spider. So there's that. My dad is doing alright now. He just had his third surgery a couple weeks ago, trying to repair the damage done to him internally. We're hoping this will be his last, and his quality of life will vastly improve. I probably owe my life to my dad. If he hadn't fought George for me, maybe I would have been the first victim George stabbed. If you would like a chance to have your story featured in an upcoming video, make sure you email it to urmaker6260@gmail.com. And if you would like to gain early access to my content, as well as some other cool perks, make sure you check out my Patreon page. It's a cool way for you guys to help support the channel and get some pretty cool perks. I'd like to offer my deepest condolences to Claire and her family. I can't imagine what their family's going through after having someone taken away from them like that. I'm very happy he was convicted, but that really doesn't bring anyone back. I appreciate you taking the time to share your story with us, and I hope it does serve as a reminder to people to be leery of people you meet online. Make sure you take the proper precautions when actually going to meet someone in person. Now in the next story with the hero dad, that's how I'm going to refer to him, hero dad, because that's badass. That's exactly what a good dad should do. I'm really hoping your father has a speedy recovery, and it's really unfortunate that he was actually out of jail before your father was out of the hospital. That just shows how our system is a lot of times. The fact that someone can make bail before the person's victim's even out of the hospital. It's truly disgusting. To all of my viewers out there, I'd like to thank you for listening, and remind you to always be careful and keep an eye of your surroundings. Sometimes it really can save your life. No person ever goes into something thinking that that's going to be the time they get hurt. It's usually this isn't going to happen to me this time. Well, sometimes it does. So make sure you try to keep a level head when making decisions. I'll catch you guys in the next video. And just remember that this world can be a messed up place. Not the normal outro, I know.